Everyone to these CLEF webinars that we've organized.
You're muted.
We're pretty excited about this. As most of you probably know, the intention was to have an annual conference. That was supposed to happen yesterday. We had 8 papers selected. We were really excited about that, but disappointed it didn't happen. These are exceptional times, and I think there's a lot of silver, despite all the struggle, there's a lot of silver linings here. And I think this opportunity to do these webinars is really important for CLEF. We've been kind of pushing very hard in recent years to increase the profile of CLEF, and I think we've got an opportunity here to do that. With the number of people signed up for these webinars is exceptional. I also want to say I think this is a really important time to recognize the importance of labor economics research more than ever. I mean, it's a challenge, but I'm realizing how important, more than ever in my career, I'm realizing how important the research we do is. We need to help governments make smart decisions going forwards. Governments need to start opening up at a certain point. That has to happen, but there's going to be massive challenges. And as I go and look through these talks that we have coming up, we've got 8 talks coming up over 4 days. All of them speak to issues around the struggles that we're currently facing. So I think it's important that we more than ever pull together as a community, a labor economics community, and do this work together. I think that's incredibly important. So the more we can communicate through forums like this or Twitter or wherever it is, I think that's really important. And I feel very proud of the community to be part of it right now at these times. So as I said, we've got 8 talks. I'm gonna not talk too much more, but the one thing I do have to say is that this really couldn't have happened in organizing this without 2 people. Anna Ferrer, who's our supreme leader in CLEF, who's just unbelievable at how she manages all of this stuff, and Grant, who managed to pull all this together and all the technology that none of us really knew anything about. So those 2 people, huge thanks for making this happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our talk. We're supposed to start at 12:15, but I've taken up some of Matthias's time already. We're going to have 20-25 minutes for Matthias's talk, and then we'll have 10 minutes of questions. Those are questions you need to enter during the talk as they come up, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And then at 12:50, we'll have our second talk. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Matthias Cortez from the Economics Department at York University, who's going to talk to us about, very apropos, the influence of economic conditions at the time of enrollment on the outcomes of graduates.
Okay.
It's all yours, Matthias.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
No? Yeah. You see the slides? Yeah.
Yep,
okay.
I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for including the paper in the program, and especially for taking the initiative to turn it into this online forum. It's too bad we didn't get to meet in person, but it's thanks for the opportunity to present in this format. So yes, as mentioned, the paper is exactly about what happens to people who enroll into university during bad times. So it's suddenly become quite relevant in the midst of these times when we're in kind of a severe downturn. And based on what we've seen in previous recessions, it's quite possible that we'll see a bump up in university enrollment or post-secondary enrollment in general over coming years. So this paper obviously started way before any of this. I should mention it's joint work with Elena Vichakova from CRDCN in Prague and Jacopo Mazza from University of Essex. And we're basically using UK data to see what happens to people who enroll in university during downturns once they're in the labor market. The motivation is that we know that business cycles have a range of impacts on outcomes. So there's been a lot of literature looking at job displacement, and somewhat related to university enrollment, there's been a literature on scarring effects, on what happens when you graduate during a recession. And there's been a lot of evidence showing that there's kind of long-lasting effects, that people who graduate during downturns, they don't have as good a job when they enter the labor market, and that those negative effects are quite persistent during subsequent years. One channel that hasn't been explored so much are these changes in human capital investment. So there's been quite a bit of literature showing that people do tend to enroll in further education during downturns. So there's evidence for a range of countries showing that enrollment tends to go up during bad times, generally linked to the fact that there's not as many opportunities in the labor market. So it seems like a good time to enroll in university and therefore invest in human capital. But we know very little about what ends up happening to these cohorts. So we started the project just kind of curious about, well, we see this increase in enrollment, but how do they end up doing when they are actually in the labor market? Maybe the students who end up enrolling during downturns are not as well suited to higher education, or maybe there's other mechanisms going on. So we wanted to explore what happens to these cohorts. And it kind of gives an extra layer to these impacts of business cycles on individual outcomes. There's this channel of human capital investment, which means that if recessions lead to more enrollment and that it's associated with more human capital investment, that's going to have long-lasting consequences on individuals even when the recession is over. So that's kind of the channel we're trying to study. So just to summarize what we do in the paper, we're going to look at the link between business cycle conditions when students enroll into college and the wage outcomes once they're in the labor market. We're going to be working with microdata from the UK. So we have data from graduates from 51 different enrollment cohorts over time. And basically the main goal of the paper is to compare the wage outcomes for these cohorts who enroll during bad times compared to cohorts who enroll during better times. Of course, the big challenge here is there's a mix of effects going on. There's going to be pure cohort effects in terms of like changes in cohort quality. There's going to be life cycle effects. There's going to be time effects. So usually there's the usual challenge of there's these three dimensions that are kind of somewhat difficult to disentangle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we try to disentangle these things to isolate kind of the part that's related to the business cycle. One nice thing about the UK data is that we also have information on their academic outcomes, so grades, both when they enter college, so we have information on their high school performance, and when they graduate from college. So this will help us disentangle, once I show you that there is a difference between these cohorts, is it coming from selection at the time of entry, that different types of people enrolled, or is it coming only after they graduate? So is it something about their human capital formation during their college years? I'll preview the results. Average wages of the cohorts who enroll in bad times are higher than the ones for cohorts who enroll in good times. So it kind of gives a little bit of a message of hope here for the people who right now are finding themselves struggling and might say, well, I guess I'll go to university because there's not a lot of jobs out there. Actually, we find that these cohorts who enroll in bad times, they actually end up with better labor market performance, better wage outcomes once they're in the labor market compared to cohorts who enroll during good times. This is not explained by differential selection into employment, so it's not like it's harder for them to find jobs and those who do find jobs do better. There's no difference in the probability of working, so their employment outcomes probability of working is similar, but wages are higher. It's not explained by business cycle conditions at graduation. So one story could have been they enroll in bad times, so they graduate in good times. And we know the conditions when you graduate matter. That doesn't explain it. And in the case of the UK, it's not explained by changes in field of study composition. If there's time, I'll mention in the US, there's some evidence of changes in field of study composition. We don't see much of that going on in the UK. When we look at these grade outcomes before and during university, we find that these cohorts that enroll in bad times, it's not that they're better selected. So that could have been one story. They're doing better because better students enroll during bad times than during good times. It's not the story most people have in mind. Most people would have thought that the people who enroll in bad times, because cohorts are expanding, you're bringing in kind of marginal students who might be of lower quality, let's say, in terms of their high school outcomes. And that is what we see. They're not of better quality when they enroll, but they graduate with higher grades and they earn higher wages conditional on their grades. So they're not better at the time of entry. Their high school grades are similar or even a little bit worse than cohorts who enroll in good times. But once they've graduated, we see their university grades, they do look higher. and even conditional on their grades, they earn higher wages. So we interpret it as a story of effort. It seems like these cohorts, they weren't better when they started, but they seem to have put in more effort during their college years, and that ends up raising their quality. So I'll come back to this in the end if I have a few minutes. Let me skip the contributions to the literature for the sake of time, since we're kind of tight on time, and tell you a bit about the details about our data and empirical strategy. So very briefly about the UK education system. Normally people go to high school. At age 16, they do these standardized tests known as the GCSE exams. After GCSEs, after high school, they go to 2 years of extra education, and then they write their A levels exams, another standardized test. The UK loves their standardized testing. So they write normally at age 18, they will do their A levels exams. This 2-year period is what normally in the UK is called college, but we're using kind of the North American terminology of college as university. So after A levels, if they want to go to university, they will enroll. And the standard is to do a 3-year degree in the UK, a 3-year undergraduate degree in the UK. So kind of the structure of our data is just standard labor force survey data that we observe over later years. But the nice thing of the data in the UK is that we have information of when they graduated from college. So we can back out, even though we observe the wage, say now, we know when this individual graduated from college, so we can infer when did they enroll. And we're looking at the labor market conditions either at the year of college entry or in the 2 or 3 years leading up to their enrollment time. And that's going to be our measure of the labor market conditions at enrollment. So in the year of college entry or a couple of years before. Most of what I'm showing you is kind of in the years leading up to entry. The data again is UK labor force survey. So it's a quarterly survey. We're looking at waves from 98 to 2016. So that's when we observe the wages in these years, but we have detailed information on when they graduated, which allows us to estimate with a good degree of certainty when they enrolled. That's a big advantage over a lot of studies which have to impute the year of enrollment based on the standard school leaving age. We see that there's a lot of people who do not seem to enroll at the standard age of enrollment. So there's a lot of people who enroll later in their lives, but we actually know with a good degree of certainty when they enrolled. So based on this, we can build that 51 years of those 51 years of cohorts enrolling between 1960 and 2010. So we have a long series of enrollment cohorts. Most of what I'm going to show you is for men. We're in the process of adding all of the results for women. Mostly they seem to look similar, but we're still kind of working on those. So I'm going to show you results for men. And then unemployment rates, we're going to use either the year of enrollment or the years leading up to enrollment. Okay, the usual challenge here is to simultaneously identify cohorts, experience, and time effects. The typical solution that's been used, for example, in the scarring effects literature is to impose some restriction on the cohort effect. So often there will be some, like you omit not 1, but 2 cohort effects, because even if you omit 1 cohort effect, you still have the collinearity problem. Or people have used like sub-national level variation, so like state level variation in the US. We're in the process of trying to do something like that with the UK data as well, but for now we just have national, like UK level data. So we cannot simultaneously identify enrollment cohort effects, calendar year effects, and the effect of year since enrollment. But we can identify 3 dimensions. We can identify cohort effects, calendar year effects, and age effects, because even conditional on when we observe you and when you enrolled, there's still variation in age because not everyone enrolls at the same age. So that's one big advantage of knowing when you graduated and therefore when you enrolled. We have independent variation in age conditional on the enrollment year. So our specification is generally going to be to regress log wages on a cohort trend. So generally a linear trend. We're also working on robustness around that, allowing quadratic or decade dummies or so on. We have our standard life cycle profile, so age and age square. We have calendar year effects to control for the current conditions at the time when the wages are observed. We have some observable characteristics that we control for, and then we have the unemployment rate at the time that you enrolled, and that's kind of our variable of interest. So our interest is in this coefficient beta. So once we've taken out cohort trends, once we've taken out life cycle effects, once we've taken out calendar year effects, what is the variation that is in wages that is correlated with the conditions when you enrolled? Okay, so let me go straight to the results. These results, again, are regressing those log real weekly wages of individuals on these different combinations of fixed effects. So in the first column, we don't have the trend and cohort effects yet. So this is like a standard regression with age, H-square, and calendar year fixed effects, as well as our additional controls. And we see that people who enroll during bad times earn more, there's a positive and statistically significant coefficient on the unemployment rate and enrollment. So if you enroll when unemployment is high during bad times, everything else equal, your wages are higher. This table is just showing this is very robust. So here, this is kind of our preferred specification where we also have the trend and cohort effects. So here we're using a linear trend to kind of control for changes in the long term or in terms of who is enrolling into university. And now this unemployment net enrollment, this coefficient is just identified off of deviations from that long run trend. The coefficient is very similar. We can also, instead of age and H-square, we can replace that with age fixed effects. That doesn't really affect the results. There, at some point over time, fees were introduced in the UK for attending university. So it went from being free to having some fees, and then the fees were increased. So we allow for like discontinuities at those points in time. That doesn't really matter. As an alternative, we just restrict to the years when the fees were kind of consistent. So people enrolling between 1971 and 2004, and that's also fine. And the last one just omits the region of residence dummy, because you might think where people live might be kind of one of the outcomes, so it could be a bad control. It doesn't really matter too much. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into the detail of what happens when we exclude non-standard students. So let me just say the fact that we can identify the 3 dimensions simultaneously is coming from this variation in the age at enrollment. But we've done some robustness checks where we look only at people who look like they enrolled at the standard age of enrollment. So based on when they graduated, they must have enrolled immediately after high school. And for them, we see the same pattern pretty much. So there, we're more restricted in the dimensions of fixed effects we can control for. But we've done a few robustness checks, and it seems very, very robust. So it's not something funny about these people who enroll when they're older. It seems to be quite robust. This I mentioned before, there's no difference in the probability of working full time. So those wages were conditional on working full time. So one story could be that there's more selection into employment, and that could explain the difference, but we don't see any difference in the probability of working full time. So that's not the margin of selection that's operating. And just to give you a quick idea of the magnitudes, one standard deviation increase in the unemployment rate at enrollment increases average cohort wages by about 3.6%, which, putting it into numbers, means approximately an extra £1,600 per year for every working year. So it's not a negligible effect. This is counterintuitive given standard models of selection into higher education. As I mentioned, you would generally expect that if there's more enrollment in downturns, these marginal students who are enrolling would be kind of worse and would drive the cohort's wages down. That's kind of what we expected going into the project. So we were kind of surprised to find the opposite. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk, the minutes that I have left, is to explore different channels that might account for this. So one first story is business cycle conditions at graduation. You might think if you enroll during bad times, maybe you tend to graduate during good times, and we know conditions at graduation matter. This graph is just showing you the correlation between the unemployment rate when people enroll and the unemployment rate when they graduate. They're actually positively correlated. So for that story that I just told to be true, they would have had to be negatively correlated. But because unemployment is fairly persistent, we see that those who enroll during bad times, they tend to exit on average during relatively bad times as well. So if we add controls for this scarring effect, the unemployment at graduation, if you graduate in bad times, your wages are lower, and the interaction of unemployment at graduation with years since graduation. So this negative effect from graduating in a recession is there and slowly goes away with labor market experience, but controlling for that does not affect our coefficient of interest. So it seems like you cannot explain our effect through the conditions of graduation, which the previous graph already suggested. Another story could be changes in fields of study. So this is showing you the change in the probability of studying these different fields, how that's correlated with the business cycle. So during bad times, when unemployment is higher, we see an increase in the probability that people go into engineering and technologies. We see decreases in the probability of going into business, admin and law, education, information communication technologies, and so on. So this could be part of the story. Engineering is a high-paying field, and we see that more people are going into engineering. However, there's other fields that are high-paying, like business, admin, and law, which are actually decreasing. And if you look at these magnitudes, once you try to kind of put them into perspective, the magnitudes are very, very small. So there's a related literature in the US showing that in the US during bad times, people do tend to enroll into more kind of challenging and generally more highly paid fields. The magnitudes in the US are much larger. In the UK, it's much harder to change what you want to study. You're kind of very set in based on what you did in high school. So you choose which subjects to do your standardized tests in at the GCSE level and at the A levels level. So once you enter university, it's harder to change what your major is. So we think that's why we see these small, relatively small effects. And just to make sure, we control for field-specific year-fixed effects. So this is controlling for what people studied and how the return to different fields is varying year by year. And that does not, if anything, it makes our coefficient bigger. So it's not explained by people having a different choice of fields. And briefly, in these remaining columns, we try to control for occupations and industries. So we try to see whether it's different selection into different occupations or industries. Again, these controls don't really change our coefficient of interest. So it seems like none of this effect is explained by selecting into different occupations or industries. It's within occupations and industries that this action is happening. These are fairly aggregated, kind of one-digit occupation and industries, just to be fair. Okay, so none of these channels explain this. So in the last few minutes, let me talk about how we look at the academic performance to try to understand whether it's what's going on is that they're better when they enter university, or are they only better after they graduate? So is it something about selection or about human capital formation during their studies? If it was selection, we would expect that their high school grades should be higher. Again, counterintuitive given standard models of selection, but it's possible that just it ends up being that better people are the ones who end up graduating from these cohorts that enrolled in bad times. But what we see is actually in terms of the number of GCSEs that they took, so as a measure of high school performance, if we look at how many GCSEs they took, the people who enroll in bad times, they tend to have taken fewer GCSEs. We see that there's a lower probability that you took 8 or more GCSEs, so these would be the very high quality students, and there's a higher probability that you took either 3 or 4 or especially 5 to 7 GCSEs. So the fact that they took fewer, they passed fewer of these standardized tests with a grade of A to C, that's more precisely what the measure is, it's suggesting that the quality in terms of their high school outcomes for these cohorts is lower, which is kind of consistent with the intuition most people have in terms of selection over the business cycle. So the other option is better quality ex post, which would suggest that they're not better at entry based on their academic performance in high school, but they seem to be better when they graduate. So that would suggest it was just about more human capital formation during their studies. So if we look at their university grade, so now this is their degree class. So it's kind of a measure that proxies GPA, their grade point average during university. We see that people who enroll during bad times, their average GPA or their degree classification tends to be higher than for people who enroll when unemployment is lower. So we observe an increase in university academic outcomes for these cohorts that enroll during bad times. So they're not better when they enter university, but they do seem to be better in terms of grade outcomes. Their distributions are kind of shifted up for these cohorts, and it's quite robust to various fixed effects. And if we look at wages, this is our baseline specification, now restricted to the subset of the data where we do observe the degree classification. It's just not all the years. We can control for the degree class, again, as a proxy for GPA. So this is kind of how well they did, dummies for different categories of how well they did during university, and that does not affect their coefficient of interest. So the main takeaway here is these cohorts that enrolled during bad times, they were worse in terms of their high school outcomes. They graduate with better university grades, and even conditional on their university grades, they're earning more in the labor market. So putting all that together, what we suggest is that it seems like there is a story of increased effort. Given that they were not better at entry, but they are better at graduation, we interpret this as suggestive of increased effort. Interestingly, this increase in effort has been seen in other contexts. For example, I mentioned already this evidence in the US that during bad times, students tend to pursue more challenging majors in the US. So that seems like consistent with the increase in effort. We don't see that going on as much as in the UK. So in the UK, it might be that you still go to the same major, but you try to put in more effort and learn more. Whereas in the US, it's more a between major effect. It would be interesting to study that further with wage evidence. We don't know of any studies along that dimension so far. And there's also evidence, for example, in the US that during the Great Recession, workers were exerting more effort. So this is instead of looking at students, looking at workers, and there does seem to be a story of increased effort during downturns. Why would effort increase? There's at least 3 reasons, we think. One is the fact that more students enroll means that there's kind of more competition. You're competing with more people. You're in a larger cohort, and that may incentivize some students to work harder. There's evidence, in fact, from the double cohort in Ontario when they got rid of one of the high school grades. So then twice as many people were like potentially enrolling into university at the same time. The cohorts were much bigger, and there's some evidence of increases in effort among male students or because of the increased competition. So that would be consistent. There could be a simple time reallocation story. So we do see that during bad times, people are less likely to be working part-time. So it might just be that then they have more time to study and they put more effort into their studies. So that could be part of it. Or there's also theories from social psychology related to the impressionable years hypothesis. So the idea that if you experience during your early adulthood a big economic shock, that really changes your attitudes. It's been studied in the context of like risk behaviors, risk aversion, and so on. So that could be also going on here. You experience this severe or like bad economic conditions around you, and that changes your attitude towards how important it is to kind of excel at university and in the labor market. Okay, so just to conclude, we find that cohorts that enroll during bad times have higher wages exposed. Consistent with economic intuition, it's not because of better selection ex ante, it's because of better selection ex post, which suggests increased effort among these cohorts. And I guess I'll stop there so we have some time for questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Matthias. That went off really well. That's a really interesting mechanism. It resonates with me personally, having done my undergraduate degree during the early 90s and being pretty worried that I was never going to get a job and outcompete my classmates. So there are quite a few questions here. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to get to everybody's questions. Maybe we'll have some more at the very end. So I'm going to have to be selective here. But one that I'm thinking about too, that the identification is definitely a challenge here. And I'm just trying to get my head around, time of enrollment, time of graduation. If everybody stays in university for 3 years, how are you separating sort of the conditions at exit, at graduation? And I think the question in particular is about demand conditions. So if coming out of a recession, companies are doing a lot of innovation, how could those kinds of demand conditions be controlled for?
Right. So yeah, identification is definitely like the big challenge here. In terms of like conditions at enrollment and graduation, we have independent variation in the two. So we can control like there's variation in the conditions when you enrolled, and even people who enrolled in similar conditions, they could have graduated in different conditions, like not for the same cohort, but different cohorts that may be enrolled during relatively bad times, but graduated when times were somewhat different. So it's kind of hard to disentangle, but it's still, in terms of the correlation, we do see that people who enroll in bad times do tend to, on average, graduate during relatively bad times because conditions don't change so quickly from being in a downturn to being in a boom. So it seems like that's not the main channel here. I mean, another, yeah, kind of story, I guess, this demand conditions that you were mentioning about innovation. I guess it would have to somehow not be reflected in terms of like the unemployment rate yet. So you enroll in bad times, and then when you graduate, suddenly there's all this extra opportunities, but we're not seeing it reflected in the unemployment rate at graduation somehow. So I guess it's kind of difficult to rationalize. It doesn't seem to be what's going on because I guess those innovations that from the demand side might just take a bit longer to materialize. So the ones who benefit might be the ones who are enrolling kind of when things are starting to pick up rather than at the height of the recession, maybe. But yeah.
Yeah. And then just one other good question here I want to get to is you condition on post-grad studies. Is that right? So what about the possibility that that's an outcome of this additional effort, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one area where we're doing still some robustness checks. I don't have it in this list. But we were before just conditioning on people who only did an undergrad. We were excluding people who continued on to postgrad. But then through like the refereeing process, the referees wanted us to include also people who go into postgrad because there could be selection on that margin. Everything we've looked at so far suggests there's not that much going on there. So the probability that you go into kind of postgrad degree doesn't seem to be related to the conditions when you enrolled into your undergrad. So we've included the postgrads and have a dummy for postgrad. We can exclude them and it doesn't seem to be a major margin there. So that could have been an interesting channel, but it doesn't seem to be much on that margin.
Okay. So I think we have to move on to the next paper. I do want to say that the people writing questions, really great questions, and people have put a lot of thought into these. They will definitely be all collected. Your efforts are not going to waste. They will be collected and shared with Matthias, and you can get in touch with Matthias, I'm sure. These are all really
absolutely.
good questions.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much.
So this is great. That was excellent. So let's try and stay on schedule. Matthias, can you hang around in case there are,
absolutely.
if we do have some questions at the end if we have time?
Yeah.
So let's move on next. So our next paper is Ricardo. I don't know if he's here. Let's hope he shows up on the screen soon. So we got Ricardo Cohn, and he's going to be talking about the effects of public school choice on private schools. There he is. Hello.
Hi. Let me just share my screen here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I think. I don't see slides.
Oh, I guess I need to share the other one.
Yes, there they are. Perfect.
Okay. So I have two screens here. I have to rearrange things.
I see.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going mute.
Okay, yeah, so hello everyone. Thanks for being in this webinar, and thanks for having my paper in the program. And thanks for the organizers that managed to transition CLEF online so that we can keep engaged as a research community. So I'll present today the paper Effects of Public School Choice on Private Schools, Evidence from Open Enrollment. So this is part of my research in my PhD. I investigate how a policy-induced increase in public school competition affects private school enrollment price and expenditure per student. I exploit in this paper a natural experiment created by the introduction of an open enrollment policy in BC in 2002 that expanded the public school choice opportunities and that way increased the competitive pressure on private schools. In open enrollment is a very common policy that aims to increase choice by allowing students to attend schools out of their catchment area, out of their neighborhood attendance zone. So proponents of school choice, they argue that it can improve outcomes of families via these two channels. The first, parents can find better schools or schools more suited to their children's needs, and schools experience market incentives to compete for students. There has been many studies that investigate the effects of private school competition of public school outcomes, but very little on how private schools are affected and how private schools respond to increased choice in public schools. So this paper will be the first evidence that of how competition from public school open enrollment affects private schools, and I look at the enrollment, prices, and measures of expenditure per student. My motivation to study this question is that the first that this idea that private school choice incentivizes public schools to produce better outcomes relies on the premises that first, families value school quality when they make the school choice decisions, and two, families view private and public schools as close substitutes. So I examined this premise in particular, whether they are substitutes and to what extent private schools adjust prices and expenditures to adapt to this more competitive environment. In the case specific of BC, that private schools are subsidized by the government, we want to know to which extent this subsidy is fostering a more competitive, healthy competition between private and public schools. We want naturally to that private schools can create some competition for the public schools so that they can raise the standards in the education quality there. The second motivation here is that open enrollment aims to make education provision more equitable, right? By allowing disadvantaged students to attend high quality public schools. But if, for example, private school students, they migrate from private schools to take available spots in high quality public schools that would otherwise go to disadvantaged students residing in out of catchment neighborhood, then this is might undermine this goal of making a more equitable education system and giving opportunities to disadvantaged students in neighborhoods of weak schools. And third, private schools, they account for a growing share of total enrollment in many jurisdictions. In BC, it's around 12%, and often budgets and funding is tied to enrollment, and we want to know how different policymakers want to know how different policies affect enrollment in private schools and public schools. And another piece of motivation here is that this is an open question. It's not clear that with increased competition, private schools will necessarily lose students. So increased public school choice may not raise this competitive pressure on private schools. If it could be the case that private schools, if they differentiated along faith, learning environment, academic focus, and families choose them for their reason, then when there's more choice in the public system, then these families might not opt to go to the public system because they chose private system for particular reasons related to this differentiated service. And the second reason why this effect might not happen as intuition would suggest is that families and students, they might have preferences over peers. So if you are in public school, you have preference over peers, you anticipate that with open enrollment, weaker students from other neighborhoods who join your high quality school, maybe they would decline the quality of your school for you, and then you, anticipating this situation, you go to private school. So in which case open enrollment would increase enrollment in private school. Just a summary of my findings is that increased public school choice from open enrollment, it modestly reduced private school enrollment, but not in the same way in all types of schools. The impact was greater on secular schools, on Catholic schools, and on secondary schools. My interpretation here is that on secular Catholic, they have a curriculum that maybe is more similar to the ones in public schools, in contrast with other Christian and other faith schools. They experience no effect in their enrollment as a result of open enrollment policy. In secondary schools, it seems, I see in the data that the students, they have to change school anyways from at the start of high school. So at that point, it seems that this choice, public school choice, increased public school choice is more salient to them, and they are more likely to move from private to public at the start of high school. So what it tells me is that there's a sizable part of the demand for private school education that is unresponsive to higher public school choice, which means that not all private schools provide competitive incentives. One interpretation that not all private schools provide competitive incentives for public schools, to the extent that they are not, some of them don't seem to be substitutes to public schools. And I find no convincing evidence of private schools responding by adjusting prices and expenditure per student. And one potential reason for that is that the voucher system, the subsidy, the grant system for the private schools in BC or independent schools, they follow this sharp threshold criterion and to determine their funding, and which constrains the ability of private schools to adjust in the spending side when facing more competition. So there's a brief outline of this talk. I'll talk a little bit about institutional context, data, insights from stylized model, my empirical strategy, and then the results. In the interest of time, I'm gonna move quickly here. On the literature that I'm just gonna, I just want to say that there's very little done on private schools. Most papers focus on student achievement, and there's a couple that focus on how the charter school entry affected private schools, but there's no paper looking at open enrollment and its effect on private schools. I will describe a bit of the institutional context in BC and about this policy. So the open enrollment policy happened for kindergarten to grade 12 in schools in BC in the fall of 2002. Before 2002, public school choice was more restricted, and students would typically attend their corresponding neighborhood school, their catchment school. And the transfers to out of catchment schools was limited because it required approvals from both sending and receiving school principals. It was, let's say, around 14% in the lower mainland. And what happened with the open enrollment, 12% was the share of students going to out of catchment schools. And since 2002, the parents now, with the open enrollment reform, the parents could enroll children to any public school in the province that had availability after who reside in the catchment are enrolled. So that made it easier for parents to send their kids to schools in different catchment areas, and that increased gradually the out of catchment, the share of students going to out of catchment public school in like 2 years increased. There was in the lower mainland, it was around 12-13%, and increased to 20-22%. In addition to public schools, there are other options like independent schools that I'm calling private here, which is in BC is called independent schools because they are not for profit. And there are also public magnet schools like French immersion programs and homeschooling. The public schools, they in BC, the students, they are guaranteed to have access to this neighborhood school, and they cannot raise additional revenue. There's a flat per student funding. There's the same within a school district, and it changes in different school districts. But schools don't have much autonomy in terms of selecting students or firing, hiring, and paying their teachers. That is all defined by the in an agreement with the BC Teachers Union. And in terms of private schools, they receive a public grant that is either 35% or 50% of the per student grant to public schools, depending on the operating cost if in public school. So if the operating cost in private school is above that of in public school, then they get 35% of the grant per student in public school. If it's below the operating cost per student, is below that of public school, they get 50%. So they have a strong incentive to keep their operating costs per student below the one in public school so that they can get this higher grant. They do have to offer the provincial curriculum to be eligible for this and to operate at a not-for-profit basis. And they have more autonomy to hire and pay teachers and to select students and to charge tuition fees. In terms of teachers, they only have to follow standard labor legislation, and for students, they can, as long as they respect human rights and constitution, they can screen students. And yes, and I broadly categorize the private schools, the independent schools, into Catholic, other Christian, Waldorf or Montessori, other secular, and other faith. Because and this can be done just by looking at the names of the schools and the non-profits associated with them that I'm going to describe a bit more later. The data I use, I create this a novel data set that combined the per grade enrollment data for all private and public schools in BC from 2000 to 2007. I geocoded all those schools to see where they are located and the distance between each other. And I use census neighborhood characteristics that change over time in my data. And the novelty here is to include this mandatory information returns of the non-profit organizations that each private school from the CRA, from Canada Revenue Agency. So all schools have to be non-profit, and most of them, almost all of them, have this authority. They have a registered charity that because they are registered charities, they have to file their financial information returns to CRA, and they are registered charities so that they can issue receipts for donation for parents, right? So that that's a big advantage of they have this. They can issue receipts that qualify as charitable tax credits, so that's why they register charities. And I get the annual information from this information returns and combine with the enrollment data, so I have the measures of spending and revenue per student for each school. So this in this figure here, I just wanted to highlight that I plot the share of public enrollment and the share of private enrollment, just showing that the share of private enrollment is increasing over time. The orange vertical line on the left is when open enrollment starts, and the orange vertical line on the right is when there was a BC public teacher strike. And on the right, you see that when there was this strike that impacted all public schools, we can see that there was some change. There was seems to have an increase in private enrollment right after this strike, which suggests that private and public schools can be substitutes. In the case in the orange line on the left, it's not that clear this change, which is not surprising because the open enrollment had a gradual impact and increased gradually over the years and affected different private schools heterogeneously. So I'm going to look to the left vertical line and its impact. So I inform my empirical analysis based on a stylized model, and the insights from this model are basically that a family that prefers a private school J star, it's more likely to choose a public school with the introduction of open enrollment, the larger the number of public schools added to the choice set. So if there are more schools around me and I prefer private school, I'm more likely to go to public school. If those schools added to my choice set have greater quality, if the price of the private school is high, the higher the price of this private school, and the shorter the relative distance to the public schools added to the choice set. Public schools with local market power, they would set their optimal price with a price markup and optimal quality with a quality markdown. So if when facing more competition, you'd expect the price to go down and the quality to go up, assuming that quality is costly in this simple stylized model. So, but once you take into account the private school subsidies, for the low-cost private schools that get the higher subsidy, they are restricted to increase quality because it's costly and stay eligible to the high-value government grant at the same time. And as a result, price reduction in this simple model would be the only tool to adapt to a more competitive market. So here to talk a little bit about my empirical strategy, I just show this map indicating where public and private schools are located in BC that are in my sample, and here in particular in Metro Vancouver, showing that there are spatially spread in the map. And my empirical strategy relies on the variation in the intensity of exposure to local public school competition among the private schools before and after open enrollment policy. So for private schools located in areas where public schools were very distant from one another, students are less likely to opt out of private schools following the introduction of open enrollment, because open enrollment creates fewer local alternatives for them and travel is costly. In contrast, for the private schools that are located in areas where public schools are spatially dense, they experience a greater increase in competition under open enrollment. In those areas, I hypothesize here that the students who attend private schools are more likely to attend an out-of-catchment public school under this new policy. Private schools, I showed they're spatially spread in the province, and you can see that in the province-wide, but also within they're more concentrated in Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, but also, as I showed in the map, even when you look at, there is quite a bit of some private schools in red. They have many private schools around, public schools around them, and some don't have as many. So I'm exploring this variation in my empirical strategy, what I do is I estimate under reasonable assumption, identify assumptions. Here, my model thinks is that differential changes in outcomes, they attribute to differential exposure to open enrollment. So I estimate this model with this formula on the screen, which is a difference in difference model with continuous treatment using the comp variable there, which is a count of public schools nearby each private school, and I also use a different index, like a weighted count of public schools nearby. They are weighted by that I'm going to define in a second here in the next slide. So this is the model I use. Comp is my indicator of exposure to local competition that we can think is the number of public schools nearby. This is the interaction with open enrollment. OE is the dummy of the years after open enrollment. X are my is the vector of time varying school grade and neighborhood characteristics coming from the census, and I have a year grade and school fixed effects. So my coefficient of interest is the theta here, the interaction that measures this the net difference in the outcome between pre and post treatment for private schools whose location face larger number of public school competitions compared to schools whose locations face less competition. And my assumption here is the typical the standard difference in difference that the outcomes of the private schools facing different levels of local public school competition. They follow similar trends in the absence of open enrollment. I can't test this directly. What I can test is the pre-policy trends that in this case I do this interactions for each years before and after. If the coefficients for the interactions in the years before are equal, then the schools the schools facing different levels of public school competition, they follow parallel trends before open enrollment. And I add time varying neighborhood and school controls to deal with potential changes in the school market that might affect enrollment and my other outcomes after open enrollment. And so this is the set of my results here on the enrollment. So the outcome variable is enrollment, and you see I use to create my competition indicator and count the number of public schools nearby. I use the radius of 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 7 kilometers, and here I use the weighted competition indicator. That is weighted by the inverse of the distance between the private and the public school, and a measure of capacity of the public schools around. So what we see here that overall, using kindergarten to grade 12, we have the increase in the open enrollment, decreasing. Let's look at column number 4 in 0.10 the enrollment. So that means is that for a private schools with a median number of competitors of 10 competitors, the open enrollment decreasing 1 student, the enrollment per grade. So this is measuring per grade. My level of the data is set per grade enrollment. So to make that more clear, so here I create this plot that the mean enrollment per grade in private schools is just below 34 students, and this average enrollment per grade is increasing in private schools, but with the open enrollment, you would have increased more, so impacted negatively the enrollment in private schools. Here I plotting my thetas, my impact estimates over time, and showing that in the years 3, 4, and 5 years after open enrollment, the effects increase, which is in line with the evidence that more schools, there was a gradual increase in out of catchment enrollment. Here I'm plotting the effect, my theta, my effect size, the effect of open enrollment for different grades, indicating that the effects seem to be concentrated in grade 8, grade 9, grade 10, but I don't have power to look only at those. And as I mentioned before, this effect concentrated in secondary school, suggesting that this is when students have to move schools anyways. So the choice, the high school choice makes it more salient to them, and they're more likely to opt out of private school then. I do some heterogeneity analysis using my same model here, but now with the interaction with some pre-open enrollment characteristics. They interact to see to what extent this effect of open enrollment is heterogeneous according to different characteristics. I use the school categories, Catholic, non-Christian, Catholic, other Christian, secular, Waldorf, Montessori, and other faith. I look at price, I look at per student expenditure, funding group, school age. So the result that is robust in all different specifications I use is that, as I show here, for other secular, Catholic, and Waldorf Montessori, the impact is negative. And also for other faith and other Christian, which are the omitted category. So, and I tried this in different specifications. This result is quite robust. It's in line with other paper that looked at charter schools, the impact of charter school entry on private school that is muted for schools that have differentiated curricula, which is my interpretation for these results. For when I look into the difference in the funding group, the one that's highly funded or with a high grant or the low grant, it doesn't make a difference in terms of expenditure, price, or school age. The results don't seem to be different, significantly different. When I look at different radius that I use to calculate the number of schools around each private school, I also, these results are robust to different radius. I'm plotting here the different radius that I use to create that variable and the effect size in each of those. And as you see here, after I use 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kilometers, the effect size is quite similar, which show some robustness of these results. When I look at the measures of private school budget, and now it doesn't vary per school grade year, it's at the level of school year. The results are not super robust when I use just the number of nearby public schools. I look here at gifts and donations, grants, the government grants, the net revenue, so the total revenue per student, net of gifts and grants, the total revenue, the total expenditure. I see here the only thing that I see with this, all those financial outcomes are in dollar per student, and I see here that more competition seems to decrease the size of the grant, but when I use my weighted competition indicator, then these results vanish. So, and I'm not showing all my results here, but I didn't find convincing evidence from this with the financial outcomes that the schools change their price. The price I use, this net revenue, is the proxy for price, which is the total revenue of the school net of gifts and grants. And it doesn't, in my analysis, I find no convincing evidence that the schools adjust prices and expenditure as a result of that. I think I'm a bit over time, so I'm gonna end here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ricardo. That was very good. So we have, again, some more questions. Maybe is it possible for you to switch back to the beginning where you had the graph with the enrollment in private and public school? That was one of the first figures. So we got a comment about that, and I'm sort of curious about that too. So I may have missed it, but there's a trend up in the private enrollment, and public enrollment is trending down, yeah?
So not this table, the chart.
No, the figure.
Yeah.
No, the one before where you had private and public.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, right at the beginning of the presentation. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So there was some concern expressed that the axes or the scale is maybe a bit difficult to interpret in this one.
Yeah. So let me explain. Let me explain. So I use different. They sum the share of public enrollment and the share of private enrollment. They sum one, right?
Okay, they do. Okay. So
I just on the right axis, right vertical axis, I have the share of private enrollment. I made them different so that you can see the increase in the private school, in the share of private school enrollment. Otherwise, it would be harder to see. But in practice, I just needed one line there.
But do you have some sense of what's driving I mean, the result that you're explaining here is going counter to the underlying trend here in private enrollment. Is that right? Is my interpretation right?
No, not quite. My result is saying that my results on average are very modest, right? So, but what I'm saying is, in the absence of open enrollment, the share of private enrollment would increase even more.
Even more, right? So what's it? But what then? I guess I can't help but wonder what's driving the big trend here towards private enrollment. Is it just the teacher strikes, or do you have?
No, the teacher. You mean like in general, right? In the entire period, not just after 2014. In 2014, yeah. So, well, there could be different things, but in general, in other places in the world as well, there was a push for choice, and private school enrollment has been increasing around the world.
Okay.
The fact that private schools are subsidized, it makes it also a bit more affordable here than in other places when they're not subsidized and they are for profit. And together with the fact, so and there are also, so these are some possibilities. There's also private schools, they rank better on average in the school report cards that are widely known by parents in BC.
Mm-hmm.
So these are possibilities.
So there was a suggestion maybe to dig a little deeper into the influence of teacher strikes, but maybe having information on when teachers are negotiating and sort of teasing out what's in the public eye about whether they've reached impasses in these negotiations and how that might influence in those even when there aren't strikes in years where there's negotiations, you may see a push. But that was one suggestion.
Yeah, no, this is certainly a paper to be written about the strike as well. We don't have I can't say for sure that this is the cause of this change in enrollment share, but it seems to happen right after. So
yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. That was fantastic. We've run out of time, so I don't want to keep people. I think we've got to keep these on schedule so people can get back to their jobs and their work and all the important work that we're doing. So just so everybody's sure, we're going to have 3 more of these next week. So we're going to do this on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Get your lunches and sit down, sit in a comfortable seat and enjoy this. Send in your questions, please, guys, because we're going to send these off to the speakers, and they're going to benefit from all these comments. So I hope to see you all again. No, I guess I won't see you, but I hope you can all join us again next week, and we will continue this. And once again, I'll just end by saying thank you very much, Grant, for organizing this. We definitely could not have done this without Grant Gibson stepping up to the plate and pulling this together for us. So with that, I will end.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.